Helping out Mr. Buckley this evening are former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the world's foremost living authority on the world, former United Nations Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, and Congressman and former presidential candidate Jack Kemp.
Whatsoever.
Mr. Kemp, do you want to dive in
Thank you.
here?
I would like to. Paul, how is it possible to get the Soviets to stop violating the ABM Treaty, to stop violating the Helsinki Human Rights Accord, to stop violating everything going back to Yalta? How is it possible to get them to stop violating SALT I, SALT II, and to bring down the Krasnoyarsk radar and comply with the human rights provisions of Helsinki unless this country makes sure that in any negotiations with the Soviet Union, we require that they comply with previous treaties before we enter a new treaty? Are you suggesting here tonight that we should continue to negotiate and to sign a new treaty absent compliance with previous treaty obligations of the Soviet Union?
The fact of the matter is that both the CIA and the State Department and the Department of Defense have concluded that the record of the Soviet Union and of the United States is a good record in terms of compliance with existing treaties.
The United States?
And the United States, too, yes.
Well, of course the United States. What about the Soviet Union? What does Paul
There have
Warnke
been
think?
some questions in the past.
Helsinki?
There always are.
Helsinki?
That basket 3, which is precatory and not obligatory, as Secretary Kissinger knows very, very well indeed.
Well,
you shouldn't sign things that say that you don't have to abide by it. And that's what basket 3 of the Helsinki Accord says.
What a
All right,
disappointment.
The
that's
one
not-
clear violation is the Krasnoyarsk
Okay, you guys.
radar, where to insist that it be taken down.
thank
Can I
you.
leave now?
It's now Jack Kemp's opportunity to make an opening statement and then play a bit of defense for a few minutes.
I want to say a word on behalf of the doves of the world, heavily armed right-wing doves of the world. It is true that the real debate is how do you preserve and promote and protect the peace. And certainly the lesson of our lifetime, and certainly the lesson of the last 50 years, is that there's only one way to preserve the strength or peace of the world, and that's by keeping this country's defenses strong and, of course, to make our economy even stronger. It's interesting that in 1988, as we debate right and left, we have the most visible manifestation of that debate taking place in the presidential campaign, as has been alluded to by Henry Kissinger and Bill Buckley and Jeane Kirkpatrick. I was fascinated by your quote, Gary. I read the Democratic platform the other day, and from 1960, and was absolutely astounded to find out that in 1960, the Democratic Party supported the freedom fighters, explicit support for the freedom fighters of Hungary. In 1960, they strongly supported the modernization of our strategic nuclear deterrent, and in 1960, the Democratic Party proudly celebrated the imposition of the Monroe Doctrine against any outside interference into our hemisphere. John F. Kennedy, you suggested that we like to quote him. We do, particularly when he says things that have eternal value, which is that we should pay any price, bear those burdens, and meet the obligation in the defense of human liberty. And I want to suggest here tonight that, in my view, Michael Dukakis has dropped like a stone in current public opinion because the American people believe the Kennedy wing of the Democratic Party, not the Dukakis wing of the Democratic Party. And he has said in his statements that he would not pay the price of freedom in our hemisphere, much less the rest of the world. He is not for modernizing our strategic nuclear deterrent. He is not for the Monroe Doctrine in Central America. He is for either the Arias Doctrine or the Rio Treaty or the UN. Does anybody in this audience, is there anybody in America today that really believes is going to be the United Nations that's going to bring peace and freedom and justice and democracy to Central America? I don't. I think the people are going to elect and vote for George Bush, not Michael Dukakis, on that very issue in 1988.
Thank you, Congressman. Don't leave. Don't leave. Mr. McGovern, do you have a question?
Jack, it's interesting to me, as it was to Gary Hart, to hear all this praise of deceased Democrats. You weren't so kind to Harry Truman and Jack Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey and others when they were alive. It's after they're gone that you discover their virtues. But do you...
George, I will suspect that when Ronald Reagan leaves office, you'll be a lot kinder to him when he leaves than you were when he was alive and ready and serving as President of the United States.
Let's put it this way, I'll have good reason to be more relieved.
I wouldn't be surprised someday, George, if you don't quote Ronald Reagan. I'm looking forward to the day.
I've quoted him a few times. But with regard to the point I'm trying to make here, do you honestly believe if John Kennedy could some way come back tonight that he'd be out campaigning for George Bush instead of Michael Dukakis?
I wasn't making that point. I was simply making the point that John F. Kennedy made the statement, and it was a wise one, that this country has a stake in the cause of freedom and democracy in our hemisphere and in the world. Right. And to me, it is a shock that the modern-day Democratic Party is neutral with regard to what happens in Central America. I think it's a vital part of our neighborhood and our hemisphere, and they want to turn their back on it, and I think that's a big mistake for the future of freedom in this
Mr. Warnke, do you have a question?
Yes, wouldn't you make a difference, Congressman Kemp, between Soviet intervention and popular revolutions?
I definitely would.
Yes. And is it
suggesting-
your opinion that the Nicaraguan situation is solely a result of Soviet intervention?
Let me ask you.
I mean, people are fed up down there. They've had it.
No doubt about it.
They're tired of exploitation.
Having served with
And we're coming in on the wrong side. Now, what we ought to do is make it very clear to the Soviet Union that we will not tolerate any Soviet military base there or sophisticated Soviet military equipment. They won't replay the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think that what the right is doing at this point is intensifying a civil war in Nicaragua at tremendous cost to the people of Nicaragua. And I'm against it.
Let's call that a question.
I had the pleasure and honor of serving on the Kissinger Commission along with Jeane Kirkpatrick and a number of Democrats and Republicans.
I read the report.
And it was a very thoughtful one, but it established the fact that there are two revolutions going on in our hemisphere. A revolution of rising expectations, a revolution that is probably inspired as much by Thomas Jefferson as anyone else, and it's a revolution upon whose side we should be. And it's taking place right now. Democratic governments, fragile, are growing in Central and Latin America, and we should be on their side with economic assistance, with trade. I am a supporter, as was the Kissinger Commission, in a hemispheric free trade zone. And that's happened or the chances of it happening are a lot better under Ronald Reagan than they've been under any other president in a long time. But there's an outside revolution being promoted by the Soviet Union. I'd ask you, Paul, why are the Bulgarians, the PLO, the East Germans, the Soviet Union, and the Cubans in Nicaragua if it isn't to establish a Soviet beachhead in our hemisphere?
As I said before, there's no chance they could do it. We wouldn't let them do it.
Senator Hart, do you have a question for Congressman Kemp?
Only to note that now we've added Jefferson to the list of the Republicans.
That's correct.
I know for a fact if he were here today, he'd be on our side.
No doubt reciting the Pledge of Allegiance.
I would like to ask this, if I may. Truman was quoted as saying this about Vietnam. Truman was asked whether he contemplated intervention in Vietnam. To the same degree it intervened in Greece and Turkey under the so-called Truman Doctrine of 47. His reply was, absolutely not. What do you make of that?
Well, maybe not, Gary. But let's not forget that in 1946, 47, and 48, the beginning of the Reagan Doctrine, or the Truman Doctrine, the Jackson Doctrine, that scoop, not Jesse, was for this country on a bipartisan basis to support those men and women who are fighting for freedom around the world. The Afghan Mujahideen, the freedom fighters in Angola, the freedom fighters in Cambodia, and you and your party recently have opposed every single effort that this country has made to liberate Grenada, to strike at Gaddafi, to flag the ships in the Persian Gulf, and to give aid to the freedom fighters other than Afghanistan.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's now time for Congresswoman Schroeder and Congressman Kemp to take a stand.
How does this
You have 5 minutes to interrogate Mrs. Schroeder.
You've been waiting for this,
Well,
right?
Pat, pleasure to be with you.
Good to be
And
here.
particularly the governor of South Carolina and his lovely wife Iris and Carol Campbell. May I say in their presence and the presence of all these friends that I have a great respect for the Democratic Party. I agree with everything that's been said here tonight that we do need a bipartisan foreign policy. Isn't it possible that this president, a conservative president, a man of the right, has made a breakthrough in the relations with the Soviet Union that are of unprecedented proportions, to the extent that, notwithstanding the fact that he went to the Soviet Union and put his arm around Gorby, he also is the first American president, to go into Moscow and lecture at Moscow State University about democracy, about freedom and private property, about human rights for Jews and Christians and dissidents, about the ability of entrepreneurial democratic capitalism to liberate the potential of human beings all over the world. Isn't that a remarkable breakthrough for a man of the right to put America in the position of watching the worldwide collapse of socialism, watching democracy and democratic capitalism transcend communism as he predicted, notwithstanding the need to be strong? Isn't it possible that Ronald Reagan has done more to break through the stagnation of the relations with the Soviet Union than some of the most liberal democratic presidents of, say, the past 20 years?
Well, certainly. I think everybody in the country, in the world, salutes the progress that's happened. There's no question. I think the INF Treaty has got some precedents in it we never thought would happen. Many times. We never thought it would happen. On-site verification, no one thought that would happen. Asymmetrical reductions, where they bring down way more than we do, so we get to zero, no one ever thought that would happen. That's wonderful. I am absolutely delighted that we did finally get one set of words coming out of the president's mouth rather than another. Now, I'm not totally convinced, and I don't think you are either, that the president, or that the Soviet Union is ready to join capitalism rather than bury it. No. So I don't think we just all celebrate, go out and have champagne and say this is it. I think you still have to be terribly vigilant. You continue to negotiate with them. Why? Because you don't trust them. I mean, we don't negotiate with people we trust, for heaven's sakes. We trust the Canadians. Why would we go negotiate a treaty with them? Obviously, we're the two superpowers, and we've got to watch them. But any progress we can make, I think it's very important. But if your premise is the reason he's doing this is because he was tough and so forth, that may be a part, but I think it's just a part. I think the Soviet Union is also looking at the world in the future. The Soviet Union is seeing a united Europe come together in '92 that will have a larger gross national product than the United States. The Soviet Union is seeing Japan be a player all over the world with very strong economic influence, and realizing their economy is abominable. And they got to figure out how they're going to play in the future. And so I think they're desperately looking at that. They're also looking at China, that found out that, communism is not working well there. So I think they're trying to speed up. I don't think it was just that we had more men. I mean, otherwise they would have capitulated in 45. We had it all.
I don't either just think that it was that. I happen to think that despite the attack on the economy from our friends on the left, it is interesting that today in the world, there is absolutely no country, maybe other than Nicaragua, Ethiopia, and Cuba, that still believes in socialism. But worldwide, we're seeing a resurgence of democratic capitalism. Right. Democracy is on the march in our hemisphere. And not so long ago, when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, our economy was in a shambles. Our defense spending had dropped to 4.9% of gross national product, the lowest in the probably the post-World War II period. We had no ability, notwithstanding the support of the deployment of Pershings and Glickums, ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe. They hadn't been done. The Soviet Union was deploying a backfire bomber once every 10 days, an SS-20 once every 5 days, building a nuclear sub probably once a month, and there was no response other than to stop the Soviets and the United States from going to the Olympic Games. Now, under a Republican president, the economy has made a recovery, notwithstanding the fact that I want it to be stronger. And I want to ask you the question. with this good news in the world, isn't it possible that even Pat Schroeder could find something nice to say about a Republican president who has led the world towards a position where every country in Europe and most countries of Asia are celebrating the resurgence of this democratic spirit?
Mrs. Schroeder, find something nice to say if you can, and then go on the offensive.
I think I did. I think I said I was delighted to see him there and doing that, but I don't think it's over, and I think we got a lot to do.
Well, I agree.
Let me say, I also wanted to pose something to you, because in your opening statement, you made a very important comment that I don't think's been answered here tonight. You stood here and you said, all right, how do we deal with Soviet violations of ABM? How do we deal with Soviet violations of Helsinki and so forth? And I think those are all terribly critical, because I said one of the things the president must do is be leaders of democracies, and the Soviet Union is clearly not. Does it trouble you at all that not one NATO ally has ever condemned the Soviet Union for violations of the ABM Treaty?
Very much so.
And don't you think one of the failures, maybe not just of Reagan, but Carter, of all sorts of people, is we have not gotten our allies to be more responsible and more mature, and that's a way, I think, that the Soviets will respond. If the world gangs up on them, then they're going to start shaping up.
I agree, but absent the universal condemnation of Soviet behavior in Helsinki or Yalta or SALT I or SALT II or ABM, it really is up to the United States, whether we like it or not, and whether we think we've entered Gary Hart's Brave New World, where the world is shifting away from U.S. influence and power. I am still convinced that whether we like it or not, the United States on this world scene is the one country on this earth that can positively affect the human rights and the economic conditions and the hope for peace and prosperity of most of the world. And thank God there is a United States today led by a president who shares that conviction that in the absence of unilateral condemnation, we must act even if it is unilateral.
Jack, I think you missed. I think you missed what I was really trying to say.
All right.
What I am trying to say is, you started out by saying how we have had a great victory on this planet, and that more and more countries are moving towards capitalism, realizing socialism is great. You know what that means for us? We're going to have to be much more competitive in the future. And we all know that. And to be more competitive, or we can't afford to go out and protect the whole world. We're only 6% of the world's population.
I agree
now,
with that too.
when you stand there and say, we're here, we're going to do it, you're doing the dial 1-800-USA,
let me answer the
and
question.
everybody else
Okay.
says, we don't have to worry because the U.S. is
How
going
much
to keep
time?
doing it.
Before I run out of time, I would like to answer that question. I think it was important to flag those ships in the Persian Gulf, not for oil alone, but to keep the Persian Gulf open, to keep the Soviet Navy out of the Persian Gulf.
We didn't have
and
to
I
do
would
it-
suggest, Pat, that the reason there's a chance to get an Iran-Iraq ceasefire and Iran-Iraq modus vivendi of whatever sorts it ends up is because Reagan took the position unilaterally, absent action by our allies, to go ahead and
He
flag
didn't
those ships, which you make so light of here
He didn't
tonight.
seek their advice first. And I think
disagree with
you
that.
are defining
disagree
leadership
with that.
as unilateral action. I define
No.
leadership
No.
as getting our allies that we have helped
I
to
think
come and
leadership.
join us.
I think
and I
leadership,
think we're in
Pat,
trouble if we don't
I
move
think
that way.
leadership, Pat, was the willingness to go ahead and liberate Grenada, even though he was criticized by 99% of the Democratic Party liberals in the United States Congress.
And-
Reagan did it, and the students came
and-
home and kissed the ground and thanked
And
Ronald
Margaret
Reagan
Thatcher.
for liberating
And
Grenada.
Margaret Thatcher also criticized. I have just got a few more minutes left, or very few seconds left. Let me ask you, I have been in the Congress, obviously on the Armed Services Committee, trying to do all sorts of Pentagon procurement reform. And you're always on the other side. That truly
Other
troubles
side
me.
of what?
Of the procurement
I am?
reform
Well,
things.
what evidence do you have that I'm on the other side of procurement reform?
Your vote.
Well, my vote for what?
Well,
Is there a vote you want to share with
I'll
this
give
audience?
some
other than-
votes. What would you like? I got some votes here. How about,
Pat, don't
Let me give you the
put
vote.
words in my mouth.
Number
I am
one.
not against procurement reform. I happen to think that competitive bidding is the most important procurement reform that we can possibly emulate,
what
because
about
we need
criminal
competition for those contracts.
penalties for people who are caught ripping off the Defense Department.
Oh, there should be a penalty. It's
But you
against the
voted
law.
for
There's a
civilian.
violation of the law at stake, and anybody that violates the
You
law should be
voted for
prosecuted.
civilian penalties, and we were pushing criminal. It's a criminal penalty to even defraud in Medicare. I mean, I think you shouldn't be so soft on these guys, and I think one of the things that we've had trouble with is that we keep buying a lot of things, and we've gotten sold equipment
This is a
that
good
doesn't work.
difference between the left and the right. I happen to think, despite the mistakes, and they should be prosecuted for making those mistakes and violating the law,
should vote
but I
that
happen
way.
to believe today that our defense and military industrial complex, muchly maligned, is still as much today the arsenal of democracy as it was in the 1940s and as it ever was. We need the proper leadership to enhance its ability to provide for the defense of this country, and I think this clearly is a difference between those of us on this side of the panel and those of
Thank
you
you
on the
both.
left.
I think
Thank
we
you
got
very
it made
much.
to
Thank you
account.
both.